I'm really confused now, because that top paragraph seems to contradict what you just said about bird feed and sugars and all that.
No, no, no. They do not sell GE seeds. They sell seeds that Monsanto sells. But not all of Monsanto seeds are GE seeds. Monsanto, Celebrity Tomato is a Monsanto variety.
Okay, and it's not GE.
No.
Okay.
Fairy Tale Eggplant is a Monsanto variety.
No, part of Monsanto's strategy was to buy up all the seed companies. So they own them all.
They bought Seminis, which bought Keto, which is where 90% of the stuff came from. So it didn't come from 20 seed companies, it came from one. Keto seed. Wow.
So my name is Jon McGoran. I'm from Weaver's Way. I've been there for decades, and I've been publishing a newspaper there for 20 years. So I've been reading about this stuff and writing about this stuff and involving myself in a lot of the product selection at Weaver's Way. And it's been a pretty fascinating and kind of scary time in food. You know, we're talking about GMOs now. Over the last 10, 15 years, we've been talking about irradiation and cloning and all these crazy pesticides and herbicides. The GMOs, or GE foods, are perhaps the scariest, and I'll get to a little more about why later. There's a lot of controversy about a lot of different ideas around them. There's a lot of uncertainty, and it's the uncertainty that's really the key. You've got these two things, and one is we don't really know what the ramifications of this are, and the other thing is that in a lot of ways, once it's out, it's out. So letting it out before you know more about the answers seems like a really bad idea, and that's where a lot of the opposition to GE foods comes from. So I'm just going to try to speed up my my presentation. So basically, from just very brief overview, from a health concern, there are the two main specific concerns are allergies. And one aspect of that is that people are concerned that they might be allergic to a plant, and a gene from that plant is taken from that plant and inserted into another plant, and then, you know, if you're allergic to peanuts and a peanut gene ends up in lima beans, then all of a sudden you're getting these allergic reactions from lima beans. And this is already starting to happen. It's not always so, you can't prove specifically and with any certainty that an allergic reaction comes from a specific food, but there have been numerous cases where that is the most likely culprit. Somebody ate something that was genetically engineered. It seems to have had a gene from another plant that this person was allergic to. They didn't know they were basically eating what they were allergic to. There is some research that shows that GE foods have a heightened allergenicity in and of themselves, so that people are having increased allergic reactions, not because they're allergic to peanuts and the peanut gene got in there, not because the lobster, shellfish gene or whatever got in there, but just because people are having greater allergic reactions to genetically engineered foods in and of themselves. And that's something that, again, hasn't been researched adequately and needs to. The other concern is gene absorption. And this is pretty scary, and this is particularly relevant when you're talking about the meat, about the alfalfa and all the soy and corn, all these genetically engineered foods that are being fed to the animals. So this is probably scarier directly, but it's also of concern when you're eating meat. Inserted genes are less stable than naturally occurring genes. Studies show that trans genes aren't destroyed digestively in humans or animals. So when they take these genes out of this organism and put it into the other organism, and then you eat that organism, those genes are not digested. They exist whole, and they survive in your digestive tract. So now you've got this gene inside you. Well, what happens then? In fact, transfers from genetically modified soy into the DNA gut bacteria of 3 of 7 test subjects. So they did studies, and they found that the flora, the bacteria that lives inside your digestive tract and helps you digest, had absorbed the genetic material, had incorporated it into its own genetic material. So now what the hell does that mean? Well, nobody really knows. but it bears some thought, especially when you consider that most of the genetically modified food that we're eating is genetically modified to produce its own pesticide. So this corn is producing a poison, right? It's producing a poison that's not supposed to be, it's not mostly a people poison. It's mostly for these, corn borer beetles or whatever. But if all of a sudden the bacteria that live inside your digestive tract are producing this poison, it could be a problem, And that's something, again, that has not been researched. There are other concerns as well. Some of the studies have suggested that there are higher rates of cancer in people that eat higher levels of genetically engineered foods. Nobody really knows why. Not enough research has been done to show if that's actually a real factor or not. But again, that's kind of part of the problem, that we don't know enough to be letting these things loose in the environment. Okay, so the health concerns are one thing. The next thing is environmental, and there's a lot of overlap between those, but there are, the Union of Concerned Scientists, they put forth 6 areas of concern. These are like, really kind of getting it down to the big 6. Engineered crops themselves could become weeds. So what's a weed? A weed is a plant that grows where you don't want it. So if you have a genetically engineered crop that you have made indestructible to weeds and other pests, and it starts growing where you don't want it, and now it's growing where you don't want it, and now it's hard to get rid of. So that's one thing. Okay. GMO crops might serve as conduits through which new genes move to wild plants, which could then become genes. That's a bigger problem. And that's happening already. That's one of the bigger concerns from agriculture, and that is that you've got all this corn and soybean and all these other crops that have been genetically engineered to produce this poison that will kill the insects that kill it, that feed on it. They're also engineered to withstand certain herbicides. So there's a lot of herbicides that, okay, well, I'd like to use this stuff to kill the weeds, but it kills my crops. So we genetically engineer the crops so that the herbicide doesn't kill them, and now you can spray that stuff any old place. You can spray it and spray it and spray it. I'll show you some statistics later that are a little scary. So what happens then is, since those genes, the genes that are spliced, tend to be less stable than naturally occurring genes, so those little gene fragments can jump, and now all of a sudden, the weeds that you're spraying with your herbicide to kill now have incorporated that gene, and now that herbicide does not kill that weed anymore. So now there's these super weeds, which are now in 26 states, and there's this thing on NPR last week about how the farmers in India who started using GMO seeds, I forget which crop it was, so that they could save money, so they could stop spending so much money on herbicides. Well, now they're spending like twice as much because they're using the herbicides that are specially made to be used with their GMO crops, their GE crops. But now they also have to go back and use all these hardcore old-fashioned herbicides and pesticides to kill the insects and the weeds that are now immune to the initial the BT or the Roundup or whatever. Plants engineered to express potentially toxic substances could persist in other organisms, or could present risks to other organisms like birds or deer. Talk a little more about that in the next slide. Monarch butterflies. We almost lost them. And I wrote a book about them, so it was very scary for me. GMO crops may initiate a perturbation that may have effects that ripple through an ecosystem in ways that are difficult to predict. And that gets to a lot of that. We don't know what happens. When you grow these huge tracts of monoculture, genetically engineered crops, who knows? Who knows what the ramifications are? We don't. GMO crops might threaten centers of crop diversity. And that, I think, is true for a number of reasons. I'll talk a little more about the aquabounty fish. One of the concerns is that when these crops that are, so far right now, almost all of the genetically engineered crops that are, being grown on farms have been engineered to withstand an herbicide or produce a pesticide. So they're either immune to this poison or they're creating this poison. But some of them, and actually those too, that kind of gives them an unfair advantage. So when they get out, when they start to compete, all of a sudden you start losing biodiversity, because these other organisms that were working really well in their little niche, now all of a sudden they're being outcompeted by these guys that have an unfair advantage. And on one hand you say, well, they got an unfair advantage, it's a hard world, Darwin would have wanted that. But we don't really know what the pitfalls are yet. We don't know what weaknesses these otherwise outcompeting plants might have. It's especially striking when you start talking about the fish, the aquabounty fish. I'll just skip ahead anyway. I'll get to it later. But basically, they're done. They're waiting for USDA approval. I wrote an article in August, and they're quoted as saying that they were hoping to have this genetically engineered fish on American dinner plates by Christmas, and they couldn't get approval. It looks like the company is probably going to go out of business, but fear not, because they just got bought, and they're probably going to be growing these fish somewhere that doesn't have the regulation that we have, somewhere like China or Brazil. But these are salmon that have been engineered to grow, to reach maturity 3 times faster than regular salmon. Well, I mean, talk about survival of the fittest, so all of a sudden, hey, mating season's only 1/3 done and everybody's spoken for. All of a sudden you start losing the native salmon because they're being outcompeted by the organisms that have an unfair advantage. And you don't really know what the ramifications of that are going to be. I mean, it seems like a shame, but it could be a big shame.
Those are farm raised or wild?
They are farm raised, so they're supposed to be farm raised, and they're supposed to be kept away from bodies of water. And in the literature, they talk about all the different precautions that they're taking, how they can't reproduce, I think because they're all female, or and they can't escape because the first year that they existed in Panama, there was a hurricane and 1,000 of them got out. So there's already 1,000 of these things out there. I mean that was 10 years ago, so there's probably more by now. But that's like a really stark example of letting loose this technology that you don't really know, that has all the components of life, and it wants to get out there.
I recently read an article or saw something online that said there was a scientist who was doing experiments with GE.
With what? Sorry.
GE soy or maybe something like that, and that it caused tumors in rats and all kinds of stuff. How do we know what's true? And
Well,
then, of course, he was fired when he spoke up about it and all that.
There's a big study that came out of France about a month and a half, 2 months ago, and I'm going to get to that. And that's part of the problem is, you don't know who to trust. And the thing is, there's so little information out there, and people are so concerned about it, and there are people with such huge resources who really want to keep it that way, that it's really hard to figure out what is what. And the reality of it is that we don't know enough. And I'll show you some figures about how little research there's been done, that has been done. When you have that kind of confusion, you can confuse people. So when you confuse people, they don't know what to believe or what to act. And there were flaws. There were flaws in Prop 37, but it was still good legislation, I think. And the way that it was defeated, well, one way was by spending $50 million in the last weeks of the election, but also by confusing people, by making stuff up, things that could not be disproven because there wasn't enough research out there. Okay, so the monarch butterflies. I'm going to try to get through this pretty quick, but it's pretty fascinating. So I forget, it was a few years ago, there was a big story, the monarch butterflies, the BT, Roundup Ready toxin, the pollen was killing the monarch butterflies. A study, I think it was in Nature, came out and said this. So they did all these studies, and they said, and it was like, oh, okay, you know what, false alarm, it's really not. And the fact of the matter is that it wasn't, right? They thought that the pollen from the corn pollen from the BT, the Roundup Ready genetically engineered corn, was that the pollen was drifting onto the milkweed that the butterflies live on. The butterflies were eating the pollen and they were dying. Turned out that they weren't dying a lot. The story kind of died out and everybody's like, oh, okay, well that seemed like it was a story, but then it's not. But But then you keep following what's happening, and as it turns out, what happened was there were like 4 strains of the Roundup Ready corn that were being grown at that point. And just by chance, one type ended up being less popular, so farmers grew almost none of it. When they did the studies, the experiments on the monarch butterflies, there was some negative impact on the monarch butterflies who were fed the pollen, from the other PT. But this one variety was just like killing them. It was just killing them. And as it turned out, we were lucky. That variety didn't sell. But if it had sold as much as the other ones, or then we would have had this huge precipitous decline in monarch populations. We would have, basically really starting to threaten them with extinction. So again, it's like, well, we were lucky there. It's like, well, we kind of dodged one. But the thing is, that gets back to that whole notion of releasing this stuff out there before you really know what it does. In India, I said the farmers are now paying more on pesticides, blah blah blah. Glyphosate, which is the ingredient in Roundup, is now a common component of the air and rain in the Midwest during the spring and summer. That's the U.S. Geological Survey is failing that. So what's happening is, first you grow all this stuff and you grow crops that are immune to these herbicides. Well, now you can just use as much of these herbicides as you want. You can throw it everywhere, and there's no downside to it because it's not going to kill your crops. So now you've really ratcheted up the pesticides that you're using. Now remember, one of the reasons that people started using GE crops was so that they could use less pesticides. That was like one of the selling points. Yeah, we'll use this stuff, it'll be great. It's not completely natural, but you can use less chemicals. Now they're starting to use more and more and more chemicals, and now you've got the whole thing with the super weeds. So now they're starting to bring back all these herbicides that they stopped using in the 70s because they were so bad for you. Okay, other environmental concerns. Genetic stability, transfers, and mutations. We talked about that a little bit. The genes can jump from one species to another, which is great if you're writing a thriller about this stuff. It's hilarious. But it's really scary if it's the environment in which your food is growing. There's another part of it is that the genes that have been engineered tend to be less stable. So you do get more mutations. And, could be a lump, could be the X-Men. The irreversibility of release, as I was talking about that earlier, once it's out, it's out. You can't unstir the coffee cup. Once you've stirred it and mixed it all in, that's it. And one of the real, it's not in the market yet, but they're in test fields all over the place. And one of the things that they're working on, and it's a great idea in ways, are agropharmaceuticals, which factor, which is another thing that I wrote about in this book I've got coming out. But that's the kind of thing that gets really, really, really scary when you see these traits jumping from species to species. So if you've engineered corn to taste sweeter, and it jumps, and all of a sudden it's cross-pollinated, or somehow the gene has jumped to your sugar beets, and now they're sweeter too, that's great. But if you've got a crop that you have engineered to produce pharmaceuticals, and then that gene jumps to another species, now all of a sudden you've got pharmaceuticals being manufactured in plants in the wild. Now the thing is, just as an aside, for me personally, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not someone who I'm very anti-technology, and I'm going to say no and no and no and resist things. But this stuff really is kind of scary. It has great benefit. I look at that and I say, wow, that's brilliant. There's people who need these drugs, and they're figuring out a way to have plants or microbes or whatever create these drugs so that they can get the medicine that they need for cheap. That's great. But there's a lot of downsides, and I think they're not adequately researched. I think we have a question back here first.
Where can we find more information on the agropharmaceuticals? This is sort of news to me, so that's frightening.
It is, right? And there's not a lot of information out there about it, but there is some. And again, it's like one of the things we were talking earlier. It's like, well, who do you trust? Mm-hmm. And frankly, one of the things that's tricky is in a in an issue like this is, you know, who's legit and who's a whack job, you know? And there's a lot of whack jobs out there. And there's a lot of people who are a little wacky but are making really good points, you know? And it's hard, you know, so actually, you know, we were talking about somebody earlier, and I, you know, there's a friend of mine who writes for Grist in the American Spectator, and he's very up on these things, and you know, and I said, hey, legit or whack job? And he said, bit of both. That's what he said. So it's like the guy's making some really good points and doing some important research, but sometimes they overstate cases, you know, and sometimes they go too far, and that really kind of undermines the legitimacy of what other people are saying. Oh, actually, no, you get a question first.
So, can you cite a crop that's part of the agro-pharmaceutical?
In the industry or in testing? None of them are, as far as I know, none of them are in production.
So,
But there's, you know, there's insulin. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, I could, if you want, I could put together.
but the way you were describing, I'm thinking, here's a big field of sugar beets, and all of a sudden they're wafting over, that they're going to be used for pharmaceuticals.
Well, because right now it's in research.
So
Once it
it's
gets to
not-
production, you know, who knows? So right now,
Who's doing it? Sorry, like what companies are doing these agro?
yeah, those 6 companies, Monsanto and Syngenta and
BASF, Dow, Bayer.
Okay.
DuPont, right?
DuPont.
Yeah.
What about Merck?
I don't know. I don't know if Merck's doing any
They're not
agro-pharmaceuticals.
doing it.
I mean, they might be
They're
contracting
breeding
with
up
them,
the
you know?
plants, but they're using
Yeah.
the.
Yeah.
I mean, I just, I'm a little confused. Or,
You and me, but.
I mean, many
And you're right on the
plants
speed.
have many pharmaceuticals. Foxglove is digitalis, that's
Yeah.
where we get
Yep.
tons and tons of our pharmaceuticals.
Yep.
Naturally.
Mhm.
They don't whack or genetically jump naturally, easily over millennia.
Mhm.
Are you saying it's because these are GE, they're genetically engineered, and the instability of their
I mean-
genetics makes them mutate into the neighboring crop, the neighboring weed? What makes this so unstable
Well, so-
that you're
so-
going to get these pharmaceuticals sort of combining like this?
There's 2 things, and one is, you know, for the most part, I think the tendency is not to find some rare plant in the Amazon that's not going to cross-fertilize with anything else around here and then put the genes in it. No, you're going to use corn. You know, that's what you're going to use.
So you're talking about easily.
So if you're using
Mixing
if you're using a crop that has similar crops around it, it's going to be much less. It's going to be much more likely to share genes. So that's
they're aware of that fact. I mean,
they are. So this cracked me up.
Why would they
Heck
not
up.
cause such
You
terror
have to.
themselves?
The corn, genetically modified corn, has to be 150 feet away from non-genetically modified corn.
It travels 5 miles though.
Yeah, but it travels 5 miles. So, but then the other thing is that yes, the genes are less stable. So you can have, you know, so just like the genes being transferred to bacteria in the gut of the people eating the stuff, or the animals picking it up and then getting it in. It could be from insect to insect, you know, or from plant to insect to plant. You know, there's a lot of vectors, and the thing is, it's not a sure thing it's going to happen. But if it happens in 0.5% of the time, and you've got 40,000, stalks of corn in the field, that's a lot. You know, and once it's out there, it's out there, you know. And if it's in a wild growing plant, that plant is going to continue to reproduce, you know. And once and there is, I'm not a geneticist, but I play one of them, no. But once you have these kind of free-floating genes lurking around, they're out there. It's easier for them to glom onto something. They've already been prepared kind of to insert, you know. And the other thing, one of the things that I didn't mention on the previous one was that, one of the things that cracks me up when I hear geneticists talking, well, we inserted this gene here, and there's this junk gene here, and this junk gene here, and then this one, makes your eyes blue. And it's like, that's not junk. That does something. It's like just because you don't know what it is. I mean, I'm guessing, maybe they're right. But a lot of these genes have, they have latent traits. And if you change this, if you insert the gene for shelf stability up here, you might turn that gene on that hasn't been active for, 10,000 years. You might. That's one of the things that the Union of Concerned Scientists, that's one of the things that makes them concerned. So, I'm gonna, oh, and so just, these are the, that's the aqua bounty salmon, and that's the regular salmon at the same age. I call them aqua bounty, the quicker grower.
Can you just clarify though, we're not gonna have that salmon?
It has not been approved. So they have them, they're growing them. They couldn't get approval because, you know, and there's a lot of people pushing for approval. And, you know, there's a lot of people who argue honestly and with good intention that there's this culture in this country that people say no to everything and they're scared and this is progress and here's somebody who's going to be helping to feed the world and these, you know, people are impeding them. They're impeding that progress. And I mean, and there is something to, I mean, that's a legitimate argument. I have to concede that, you know. I just think that there are many more arguments against it.
Rodale just reported, I think yesterday, that
Outcry. I don't know where it stands right now. I do know that just like 3 weeks ago, I saw something in Sustainable Food News that, I forget, actually I think Aqua Bounty might be the name of the company. And people are calling the fish the Aqua Bounty, but it has another name. I can look it up for you. I don't know what the name of the new company was. The old company, I think it was owned by a single guy or one primary investor. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a quick background of how we got to where we are today with the regulations. And basically, the idea of genetically engineered food came up in the 80s during the Reagan administration. The administration, they basically said, yeah, we don't care what you do, but we want you to use the existing framework. We want you to use the existing laws to govern the regulation of genetically engineered food. And they were like, we don't really, and just work it out. So it fell to the USDA, the EPA, and the FDA, and they kind of did it amongst themselves, kind of trying to figure out who's going to do what. And of course, they didn't have an applicable existing framework because this was an entirely new technology. So you had a weak and non-intuitive regulatory framework. For example, and I like this, the current framework gives FDA authority to regulate genetically engineered fish under the federal drug laws. The other thing that was, so two things. Policy was based on the assumption that genetic modification posed no unique or special risks. They just assumed that. You know, they said, well, based on the assumption that it poses no risk, and that came out of nothing. I mean, there was nothing behind that. The Food and Drug Administration gave GMOs, GE foods, generally regarded as safe status. So that's what their status was. They're generally regarded as safe, meaning that the industry had no obligation to conduct long-term safety studies, and they haven't. Much of the regulatory process is voluntary, meaning that Monsanto can say, hey, you want to have a look at this? Nah, okay, whatever. So, between 1992 and 2002, the period during which GMO crops moved rapidly from test plants to farm fields to dinner tables, the USDA spent this is what they spent on research. They spent $1.8 billion on ag biotechnology research. 1% went to safety testing. So it's $1.8 million, I think. 1.8 million, no, 18 million. 1% of 1.8 billion is 18 million. $18 million, that's a little less than $2 million a year for all safety test research on GMOs during 10 years. The GMO industry argues that GMOs have been proven safe, and here's the thing, and they pretty much have in 90 days. It's very rare, unless you have one of these allergy issues, that you're going to have an ill effect. But none of their research, pretty much none of it, goes longer than 90 days. And that's something that is going to come up again. Okay, so here's the French study. I almost didn't put that picture in there, but I need to put pictures in, otherwise it's worse. So about 2 months ago, there's a big study that came out. There's a very controversial study. It came out of France. They said, we have proven beyond a doubt. Well, first, okay, so the study, it was a 240-day study. So this is like the first time there's a major study of longer than 90 days duration, right? They had 200 rats. They broke them up into groups. 3 had, a mixture of Roundup Ready corn. 3 got so one group had Roundup Ready corn treated with Roundup, as it was intended. The other group got Roundup Ready corn, but not treated with the pesticide. The third group got no GMO corn, but they did get tiny amounts of the Roundup, the pesticide, and then there was a control group. A 2/3 of standard lab rat chow, and 1/3 of non-GMO corn. Okay, so the conclusions of the study were stunning, right? Severe adverse health effects, including mammary tumors, kidney and liver damage, leading to premature death in both, both the Roundup Ready corn and the Roundup itself. So all 3 of those groups that either had Roundup, the pesticide, Roundup Ready corn, or both, 50 to 80% of the females had developed large tumors compared to 30% in the control group. Now 30%, that seems like a lot, and that's part of the controversy as well. Among males, 2.5 to 5.5 times higher liver congestions and necrosis, 2.3 times more incidence of marked and severe kidney disease. The rats receiving the GMO and or Roundup, up to 50% of the males and 70% of the females died prematurely, compared with only 30% and 20% in the control group. Of the 54 comparisons between treated rats and control rats, in all but 4 of them, the treated rats showed worse outcomes. And this, I found this fascinating. Almost all of the ill effects manifested only after 90 days. So that caused a big start. And then there's this backlash, because people were assailing the legitimacy of this study, and in a lot of ways, rightly so. But I still think it's an important study, and I think that there's reasons why it had, upon reading it, and at first it was like, I was like, oh God, here's another thing that's going to like undermine everything and muddy the waters and confuse everybody. Some argue that the sample size is too small, as it turns out, and it was. I mean, and they said, look, this is compelling. It's not conclusive, but it's compelling. And it's kind of basically like the purpose of the study is to say, we need more research like this that's adequately funded and broad enough to have meaningful, conclusive results. So the sample size is too small. These studies are really expensive. So it was 200 rats, which that's not nothing. But remember, it said it was testing them for 54 different markers. So that's a lot. That's a lot. 200 rats with those many things. The people said that the rats that they used were prone to tumors, which I guess, I can't argue with that. Apparently that is acknowledged as true, and I don't know why they used these rats. I mean, they are lab rats, so it's not like nobody uses them.
Rats.
What's that?
The rats themselves are genetically modified as well.
Yeah, right. But the fact remains that, yes, 30% of the control group got tumors, but 50 to 70% of the treated ones did. I mean, that's compelling. Some people question the bias of the researchers, and I don't know enough about the study to say one way or another. The scientists who conducted the study did have, they had previously conducted studies which I think were similarly inadequately scaled, and some had questioned them, and they had previously stated their opposition to GE foods. So they did have a bias. They were pretty open about it. I don't know what to make of it. But the results were startlingly dramatic. The small size was due to the cost. Also, it was a highly regarded journal. So people did take issue with the study, but it was in a scientific journal that is well regarded.
What journal was it, please?
What journal? I forget. I could look it up before you leave here and get back to you. I mean, I had it in my notes, but I didn't put it in this. And in my mind, the one thing that it does prove conclusively is that more study is needed. That this stuff has been, just drastically under-researched. Yeah, who's done this before? All right, okay. Since the scientific jury is still clearly out, the regulatory climate is not conducive to increased regulation of GMOs. The focus is turned to labeling. So that's the thing. If we don't know, And if the regulators are going to say, we're not going to regulate it, then it's up to us as consumers to decide if we want to eat it and if we want to support it. And the thing is, you can't make that decision without labeling. So the first shot in the war was the Prop 37. Well, first, this is just an infographic that I just grabbed from the Just Label people, but it's pretty interesting. 91% of Americans, and this has been pretty consistent, they've done these, a bunch of these surveys, 91% say they want GMOs to be labeled. 89% of Republicans. It's like 93 Democrats, 89 Republicans. So it's pretty consistent across gender, across political spectrum. 40 countries, including the EU and China, I think, have GMO labeling. So this is not something that we're not, you know, we're trying to get way ahead of the curve on, you know.
Gave that up, thank you.
It's pretty crazy. Only 4% of Americans oppose labeling GMOs. I wrote a column. You know, one of the reasons one of the ways that the opponents of Prop 37, which was the California GMO labeling initiative, one of the things that they cited. I mean, they spent almost $50 million to defeat this. And one of the reasons they cited was they said it was going to cost consumers too much because we'd have to change all those labels. Now, some people said it wouldn't really have cost them a penny because they had 18 months to comply. Almost every packaged product revamps its labels in some way or another over the course of 18 months. That's really kind of a non-argument. But a woman did an economist did a study, and she said her analysis was that it would cost between $0, so it might have absolutely no cost at all. It could cost as much as $1.25 a household. So I told I wouldn't. Who did I tell? I told somebody I wouldn't be too flippant. I'm known for being a little snarky sometimes. They said, tone it down a little bit. But I wrote this column and I said, okay, well, you know, what if it cost up to 3 times that much? You know, what if they were wrong? You know, what if it didn't cost $1.25 a household? There's 13 million households in California. What if it cost 3 times that? And if you take $1.25 and you multiply it by 3 and you multiply it by 13 million, you get what they spent to fight it. That's exactly what they spent to defeat the measure. And but that was one of the most important things, you know, one of the most important factors in the people who I think 2 months before the election, 65% of the people were in favor of it. And that's right when they started spending the money. $50 million they spent. It was like $48.7 million. And they won. So I put this up here. I mean, this is all stuff you already saw. But this is interesting. Scientists recently found genetically engineered insecticide in corn showing up in the umbilical cords of pregnant women. Yeah. Let's get some more research. So, Prop 47, or Prop 37, that's what we just talked about. So the newest thing, you know, now that the battle is returning to the national stage, there is something going on right now, and again, it's something that, it's a little inside baseballing, but there's a Monsanto rider. Basically, it's an amendment tacked onto a bill they're trying to get approved in the lame duck session of Congress that would give Monsanto this huge, huge latitude. And basically, if I understand it correctly, let me see if I include language. Okay, yeah. So the focus is now on the Monsanto rider, which some argue, most people, I mean, some people say this wouldn't happen, but pretty much is generally accepted that this is the effect of it. That would give Monsanto special rights, would allow genetically engineered crops to continue to be planted even when a court of law has found that they were approved illegally. It would grant temporary permits and deregulations of genetically engineered crops even if a federal court rules that the USDA hadn't adequately considered the environmental or economic risks, and that if a GE crop approval was shown to violate the law and to require further analysis of its harmful impact, as several courts have concluded recently, that provision would override any court-mandated caution. so that the planting could continue until it was finally resolved. So that's just kind of crazy, you know, and it's this special kind of rider for Monsanto that would override the courts and really override the legislature in a lot of ways until, you know, and these things, you know, they can drag out for 15 years. At the end of 15 years, like, hey, yeah, you're right, it does kill you. But meanwhile, because of this rider, we've been planting all along. So, anyway, that's, thank you.
Wow. We have until 9 o'clock. We do want to talk about the co-op, but I'm guessing that a lot of you still have more questions for John and Tracy. And I don't know about any of you, but I've learned a lot and basically a whole lot more scared than I was when I came in here.
Yeah.
But one of the things that makes me a lot less scared is that Tracy told us in the very beginning that one of the best ways to avoid GMO products is to eat locally and to know where your food comes from and how it's produced, and that is what our co-op is going to do for us. So I'm going to let everybody continue to ask any questions they have on the GMO issue. Tracy, you want to get up there and be with John as people just make sure?
Because I think it's an important thing, and you know, I've been a member of a co-op for 30 years, and you know, there is a very important distinction between, and you know, I'm not anti-capitalist. I think that, you know, businesses that make money, I'd like to make money, but there's a big difference between a co-op that is owned by the people who shop there, and that has as its mandate, it is not trying to make a profit. Any profit it makes either goes back into the store or goes back to the people. You know, a lot of the worst aspects, a lot of things that have gone wrong the most in the American food system have been allowed to do so because not enough information is there. And the reason the information is withheld is because the people who are selling it, they want you to buy it, and they know that you wouldn't otherwise. And co-ops aren't there to sell you stuff that you don't want to eat. Co-ops aren't there to make money from you. Co-ops are there to sell you the food that you want to eat. And it's a very important distinction, having your food coming from someone who's on your side, who's in it with you, and who you own, and who is there to, you know, to do your bidding. So shop co-ops.
So is there legislation, since that Act 37 didn't go through, and there's this whole debate about GMO, GE, and there obviously needs to be clarity and delineation there. Is there legislation, is there any work, appeal, changing, is that in the works at all?
I mean, I don't think there's any legislation pending. There's the Monsanto rider, and that is legislation that's pending. And then there's also, I mean, there are, I mean, I don't know exactly how this would manifest, but a year ago when the Just Label It campaign started, and actually they did this march across the country and they came to Weaver's Way, which was great. They got 1 million signatures in 180 days, more than had ever commented on anything with the USDA. They now have 1.2 million comments on file with the USDA demanding labeling. Now, and some people, you know, Bill Maher was taking Obama to task the other night because he hasn't done anything about it. And he said he would when he ran the first time. And he was a co-op member. He was a member of, I forget the name of it, in Chicago. Hopefully in the second term, he'll bring that back. I mean, you know, you look at those things, 91% of Americans want it. You know, you think it's kind of a no-brainer. But it goes to show you how much money is out there to, you know, to be willing to piss off 91% of the people.
So from a behind-the-scenes standpoint, from the seed industry, there is a seed trade organization that has an organic committee that I'm a member of, and we meet constantly, and it's sort of a trying to get ahead of the game. We meet with the National Organic Program division of the USDA to try to make sure that the wording is going to be such that it will be genetically engineered when it happens. So what our concern is that, I mean, this movement, hopefully, I want it to work. I want legislation to pass. The industry needs to make sure that the wording is proper so that when it does, you get the results you want. So, but that's kind of a behind the scene thing that is happening. But it's complicated because government officials and government paperwork and government mess is a lot to deal with.
Is perhaps the language issue though, what John was talking about before, it's not using the term genetically engineered, it's getting the USDA to change the definition of GMO.
It is, that's what I'm saying,
Because
that's
what
what
on
we're
the
doing.
slides that John showed us a little while ago is that in other parts of the world, GMO means what we came into the room thinking of. So if we go and create genetically engineered for the US and the rest of the world is saying GMO is genetically engineered, we're only going to perpetuate the language problem.
I'm not suggesting that everybody has to change and not label it GMO. I'm suggesting that, I'm just saying, this is what it really is behind the scenes. If anybody ever gets involved in lawmaking and pushing for things being written on paper,
Right.
it needs to be the
Yeah.
correct terminology.
Well, I agree, but what I'm saying is,
Not
but-
terminology so much as the definition, that connection.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, if just looking at your slide, I mean, one of the very last slides had something, I don't know if it was the European Union or a bunch of countries listed GMOs as anything that contained DNA or whatever that did not occur in any kind of a natural way. Okay, that's not what the USDA definition is. The USA definition is, okay, well, you splice things together, you do all this other stuff, you simply pick the tall ones, and that's, so if we use a definition that's not what the rest of the world is using, I don't see the problem going away, regardless of what regulations we put in.
I mean, I think, I do wonder, well, first off, I wonder what the genesis of that definition is. I wonder when, that was made the official definition of GMO. And one of the things, I mean, USDA has a lot of Monsanto-friendly people in it, I mean, they do.
That's what I'm saying, that's where their money goes, it's to create confusing and to create loopholes.
Right.
When you make sure things are worded wrong, you're creating a loophole that you know you can jump through later.
Well, I'm very glad we have Tracy on our side.
Yeah,
Thank you
really.
for serving on that committee.
So I'm all supportive of the co-op, and I feel fortunate to live where I do, where I get everything from local farmers and avoid all the genetically modified stuff, and that's great. And I try to use my loud mouth to teach people and educate people of how they can stay away from it. And but I also think I like to be able to tell people that we have to use our voices to speak up and tell our lawmakers we want labeling and we don't want Monsanto to get a free ride and those kind of things. But I do, in sort of the back of my head, wonder, does it matter? Do our signatures and do we continue to speak up to our lawmakers and continue to speak? And so my question is more of an opinion. Do our voices make a difference? Are they making a difference?
Yes. I would say yes. I would say,
Keep telling people, speak up. It's the whole thing that America was built on, it's our voices. Because people tell me, it doesn't matter, these politicians don't care because they're all in bed together. And I say, no, you have to speak up. How many people actually do speak up? So I'm just,
Right.
Does it make a difference?
There was a joke that I had that I'll just betray my political allegiances here for a second. I'm glad I didn't get a chance to use, but I was dying to say the election day that Mitt Romney won with a landslide 1% of the vote, because that's the problem. The problem is the money in politics, and that's why you've got a situation where here's an issue where 91% of Americans, and this has been, there have been a bunch of these surveys, and they've all come out with, and that's a really hard, solid, across-the-board number, 89 Republican, 93 Democrat, and we still can't get it done. So why is that? And it's because of the money in politics. So, and that's, I think with a lot of things that are wrong with the country, deep down, it's that. And, but I do think that, maybe I'm a Pollyanna, but I think that 91% of the public, they're going to get what they want. I think 91%, 65, 70, probably not, but 90%, yes. So, but it's a fight, you know, you do have to exercise your voice, you know, you do have to use it, you do have to make it heard. So, I mean, there's a great group, the justlabelIt.org, and there's the Right to Know Coalition.
Yeah, I think Right to Know, if anybody really wants to dig down into what is good information versus what is not, Right to Know is one of the better
What's
places
being
to
done
get
to beat
correct.
this Monsanto rider?
Oh, people are putting stuff on Facebook all over the place. Apart from that, I don't. That's what I do.
Well, we're safe then.
Yeah, right. But, you know, if you go to those websites, they, you know, actually, no, I did. I signed petitions and I sent letters, you know, they made it very easy for me, okay? I didn't have to get a stamp out or anything. But, you know, I think this right now, the Monsanto rider, it is an insidious little piece of political trickery, and it's hoping to get by quietly. So I do think that letting people know that you know it's there can have an impact.
And I would say, while I don't disagree with you and while I feel those exact things to myself, what I like to think is I can do that and I can make choices for myself about what I put my body and where I spend my money. And that goes back to knowing exactly what to eat, what not to eat. And trust me, like I said, I wish it did me, you know, more than just help. But it's no fun not eating any sugar or any processed foods at all, or any non-organic meats or dairy. But if you really want to do it, that's what you do. And that's what you tell people you do, and that's just a choice you have to make. And then that hopefully will fuel people to think about it more and decide how involved they want to get.
And I do think that Americans are, by and large, I mean, so I've been in Weaver's Way for 30 years. I started working there when I was like 6. And we were in the, you know, we were whistling in the dark back then. You know, people was like, oh, co-op, you know, a bunch of whack jobs, you know, your tofu and your granola. And it's been very heartening to see the rest of the world really kind of come around to a lot of the things that co-ops are about. But among them is, you know, this notion that, you know, every time you buy something, you're voting. You know, and if you support your co-op and you buy something that's locally grown, that might cost a little more than a box of some processed soy and high fructose something on the box, on the shelf at, you know, wherever. You know, you're making a statement. You know, you are voting. And the thing is, I mean, and frankly, you know, Whole Foods didn't come from nothing. And that's a very successful business, you know. And it looked at, you know, I mean, it kind of cherry-picked. It looked at what co-ops were doing and said, well, if I can do that, but still have a black heart of stone, I can make a lot of money. I can't Whole Foods. It comes from love. But you know, these are important ways, and you know, and not just about revitalizing, you know, main streets, and not just about giving work, you know, giving livable wages to local food producers, but really making an important statement.
So going back to the digestive issue with the bacteria, the GE product manipulating and mutating, whatever, and you go to a doctor, you say, I have a stomach ache or I have migraines. Very few doctors are going to say, what do you eat?
Right.
That's just across the board, because doctors in general are not trained in nutrition.
Right.
So that's why I would say it's up to you to stop eating that stuff.
No,
and
I
see
know
how you
that,
feel.
and we all know that, but I'm just saying from a statistical point of view, when you're accumulating information that's pointing to GE food or genetically modified food, you don't have a basis for it because the doctors aren't there asking.
Well, you're right. And the thing is also, again, so little research has been done about it that we really don't know what the vectors are that would cause the upset stomach. You know, we do know that statistically, and I left this out, I meant to put it in, but statistically, you know, there have been these, you know, significant increases in a lot of disorders, a lot of cancers and diabetes and all these other things, and people are like, well, and you know, there's no causality, you can't prove it, but a lot of these things have paralleled the rise of GMOs. And you know, this skyrocketing allergenicity. You know, all these people. You know, you know, all these allergies that didn't used to be around. Not when I was a kid. You know, you ate peanuts. You know, so who knows if that's what it is? But it's something, and this could be it.
I just say, I would encourage people to work with a knowledgeable health coach who's I'm not making fun of myself, I'm a health coach, full disclosure. or a naturopathic doctor who knows these things and is open to these things. The current modern, like, Western medical system, they get like 2 weeks of nutrition, and it's like the USDA, my plate, basically is what they're told, and that's all political, USDA, eat corn, those kind of things. So I think that's another way people are voting with their dollars, that they are spending money outside of the, here's my insurance or whatever, and they're spending money, and they're seeing huge improvements in their health, and I am one of them. And so that's another thing people are saying, and you can't ignore that anecdotal evidence that people are like, okay, I'm not eating GM foods anymore. I have a client, she stopped eating soy, and wow, amazing things started happening. And her health improved like dramatically. So anyway, I just say that, you don't have to go to a modern medical doctor. Seek other medical professionals. Natural,
Add that to your.
So I'm gonna take over now and just do the co-op thing, but before I do, I want to give John an opportunity to do a shameless plug, because he did travel all the way from downtown Philadelphia to come and share his knowledge with us. So give us your
I will.
shameless plug,
I'll give you the
please.
shameless plug.
Quickly.
Yes. Quick should be shameless should be quick. So I brought some bookmarks. You can read about it. But basically, so I've written several crime novels. I had a series of forensic thrillers under a pen name D.H. Dublin. But as I've been writing about this stuff over the years, I mean, more and more, it's like the stuff that I was writing in the co-op newspaper was reading more like a thriller. Well, maybe not more like a thriller, as much like a thriller as the book that the books that I was writing. So I wrote a thriller about that, and I've just got a fake jacket. It's not coming out yet, but it's called Drift. I've got some bookmarks here. It's got some very nice blurbs. But basically, it's about the love interest is an organic farmer, and there's this agro pharmaceutical stuff next door that's corrupting her crops. And then there's also drug dealers and machine guns and stuff like that. The publisher's actually giving it a bit of a push because of the topicality, and it was a 2-book deal. I'm working on the second book, which actually involves colony collapse disorder. So there's genetically modified bees and a company that's not Monsanto. But I think it's a really good book, and I haven't nailed down the date of the event yet. The publication date is July 9th, although the pre-order button just showed up on Amazon. But I'm doing a book launch at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, so hopefully it'll be a pretty big event. They're going to get behind it, and
And look for it in the Doylestown bookshop.
That's right. Absolutely.